Welcome to Bad Drawings, Bad Explanations, where I, your fearless host Eli, use really shitty pictures and really bad explanations to explain really important sociological concepts. Today I will be giving you a bit of a crash course in a concept that is incredibly important to queer and feminist sociology. It is called gender performativity. Now, gender performativity is also important to other fields in queer and feminist studies, such as literature, art, and even the natural sciences. And you might have heard it also being described as doing gender. Because there's absolutely no way on this earth that I would be able to explain over 2 centuries, perhaps even more, of history that has led up to the conceptualization of gender performativity, here is a very brief spiel before we get into the incredibly juicy details of what gender performativity actually is. In ye olden days, when Jelly Shoes and Sailor Moon was at the height of its popularity, queer theorist and philosopher Judith Butler introduced the term gender performativity in their book titled Gender Trouble. Since its publication, Gender Trouble has been a formative text for both queer and feminist theories. However, Judith Butler, as they will say themselves, was not the first person to consider gender as not inherently linked to a person's biology. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, biologists, political scientists, feminist philosophers, sociologists, and many others have made theoretical contributions that inform Judith Butler's social constructivist view of gender. For example, in the first chapter of Gender Trouble, Butler introduces the chapter with a series of quotes from influential thinkers that directly contributed to their construction of gender. One of the leading quotes is by feminist philosopher and social theorist Simone de Beauvoir's work titled The Second Sex, and that quote states, "One is not born a woman, but rather becomes one." Simone de Beauvoir is just one of many theorists that contributed to Butler's development of gender performativity. Now that the incredibly rough history lesson is over, we can finally take time to break down gender and performativity separately in order to understand how they relate as a collective concept of gender performativity. Inspired by the workings of philosopher John Austin, Butler outlines performativity to mean a repeated and stylized set of acts that create the appearance of a natural gender identity. Performative, in this sense, is not used in the theatrical way that you may think of when an actor in a play performs the role of a doomed heroine or a damsel in distress, as that implies conscious decision making by the actor. Instead, Butler argues that there is no doer behind the deed or no actor behind the performance. Instead, the gender doer or actor gets added falsely after the fact. I like to think of it as an example of a post hoc fallacy that confuses temporal sequence with causal relationship. An example of a post hoc fallacy is thinking that a chicken came before an egg because a chicken lays an egg. However, that original chicken must have came from an egg, so the temporal sequence is a little bit wishy-washy. Following this wishy-washy idea, Judith Butler develops their definition of gender based on this understanding. Outlined in their 1988 essay, Performative Acts and Gender Constitution, an essay in phenomenology and feminist theory, Butler argues that gender is an identity tenuously constituted in time, an identity instituted through a stylized repetition of acts. This stylized repetition of acts includes things like bodily gestures and movements, and Judith Butler argues that bodies become their gender through these series of acts when they are renewed, revised, and consolidated throughout time. And Butler unlinks gender from biology by demonstrating that gender is only real to the extent in which it is performed. For example, male-bodied people are often associated with athleticism or sports, and when male-bodied people lose their athleticism, they also experience a decrease in masculinity. Queer theorists often use the example of drag queens to further demonstrate the extent of performance and to demonstrate how gender can be subverted. For the purposes of demonstration, let's make a list of stereotypical physical and adorned qualities often associated with women. You might immediately think of long hair, makeup, dresses, boobs, etc. With that in mind, let's compare these two pictures. While both people have the previously mentioned characteristics that signify woman, one is doing gender in a way we see as right, and the other is doing gender in the way that we might see as wrong. The drag queen is emphasizing those stereotypical characteristics while the famous actress is adequately performing those expected characteristics. To summarize, when we consider gender performativity, we need to remember that the performance is not always the conscious or controlled presentation of the drag queen, but can be and often is the unconscious or ascribed acts of the bill wearing babies. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned a little something from these bad drawings and bad explanations.